And now for one of my most enjoyable reviews, a tributary but also uh, rough around the edges critical review of Terrence Mckenna. And perhaps the most important way, at least for me, to review Terrence Mckenna is on the effect that he has had on me. So I came across Terrence Mckenna roughly 3 or 4 months ago, and it was sifting through TED Talks and finding a banned TED Talk, which, since I just had a interaction with TED Global, seeking to make the talks more impactful, and was not terribly impressed with how they handled the idea. And since many of the most important ideas and people and substances throughout history have been targeted for censure and banned, as soon as I saw banned TED Talk, I immediately thought there was a good chance that this was worth listening to, and it was. Graham Hancock and Rupert Sheldrake, two of the most influential thinkers in their field, were banned for no particular reason at all, as is usually the case. And so I immediately got interested in Rupert Sheldrake, ordered his book on Audible, got into a brief correspondence with him, and in the process of wanting to learn more about Rupert on YouTube, I came across the trialogues. And that, of course, introduced me to Terrence Mckenna. It wasn't actually the first introduction, though. That had been in an Audible book called Food for the Gods, which had opened up my mind to my biased skepticism of substance and drugs, which boiled down to, number one, as a child, I had had irresponsible adults on bad trips exacerbate the issue of irresponsible parenting and juvenile parenting by leaning on me, the child, for their emotional needs, again, in a bad trip. And, it's just disgusting. Disgusting to see adults putting their emotional needs on the children that they are responsible for protecting, for supporting. And so this, along with my other rather skeptical impression of hippies, starting with my parents, of just tuning out and basically talking less coherently than usual under the influence, and not doing anything useful about anything. I was just very anti-drugs, which fit right in with the national theme of exaggerating every single thing that's wrong with drugs. And so I made it to age 40 without ever being drunk, without ever taking a toke, without being at all interested in any form of drugs at all. I also wasn't interested in things such as cocaine, which created an initial lift and then led to an addictive cycle. And so, coming in anti-drugs, the pivot point for me came when I was feeling suicidal, around which I came to learn later was undiagnosed complex PTSD from childhood abuse. And so the issue for me, as I was very seriously looking at suicide, 100,000 in therapy hadn't helped. $100,000 in crystals hadn't helped. $30,000 in Lazarus and other channeled entities, certainly had not helped this area of PTSD. I'd put in the 1,000 hours of meditation, the 1,000 hours of energy work, the 1,000 hours of therapy, bought the gadgets, done the diet, etc., etc. And having achieved most of my goals and dealing with recurring emotional flashbacks and recognizing that this was not going to get fun as I became older. You've got adrenaline going for you when you're setting out and starting your first business and getting out of debt and building your first house and building up savings and creating a retirement fund. It's kind of, it goes along with the cultural program of produce and produce. And yet, here I was, having done all the check marks, the positive attitude, the business, the diet, the meditation, the therapy, the this, the that, the other, and it was not cutting it. And so as I was looking at whether or not to check out, or if there was one area in life that I had not explored, I kind of put I knew I felt like dying, and it seemed perfectly rational to me when the pain is higher than the pleasure, number one. Number two, when that's been that way chronically in waves throughout my life. And number three, when I've done everything that I've heard to do more extensively than almost anyone that I knew, and it wasn't working, which was adding to disappointment, shame, chronic fatigue, and just not interested in listening to a lot of advice from other people. So I did a review of everything that I hadn't explored, because one of the great things in my life has been being wrong. It was wonderful when I had a couple of years before expressed an interest in, I felt kind of just done, like I've done pretty much all of my goals, and my material reality was already above what I cared about. The house was beautiful. It's like, so what? None of that deals with chronic pain, with chronic loneliness, with a culture that doesn't want to deal with depth, that doesn't want to slow down and be present. And I'd even done the traveling thing, traveling around the world and spending a lot of my time in Thailand, which definitely, I was looking at, is there anything I haven't done? Possibly a radical move to Thailand from the Bay Area. But I did a rigorous analysis, and I realized that drugs and psychedelics were something that I had never even looked at, because of my own skepticism and disgust from childhood experiences, combined with the fact that no one had seriously recommended them in a framework that made sense to me. So the wonderful thing about suicide as a serious contemplation is that you got nothing to lose. And so basically, with this attitude that I've got absolutely nothing to lose, because if anything else doesn't work, I can just die, as planned, I looked into everything I could find on psychedelics. And Food for the Gods and acid test were pivot points in that. Now, I actually had some traumatic experiences with both, because both of the sitters that I used, one had kind of facilitated an overdose on MDMA, in which I had had my one and only blackout in my entire life. And not only a blackout, but a blackout as I was getting out of the bathtub, and a blackout that left this part of my neck falling against a glass jar, which thank goodness didn't shatter and rupture my main arteries here. But that was experience number one. And experience number two was my therapist, who I'd chosen to be a sitter, escalating what was my first homosexual experience on MDMA and mushrooms together, and then for legal reasons completely dropping the ball and abandoning and shaming and putting up stuff in a way that left me in more loneliness and pain than I'd ever experienced in my life by a factor of 5. So I was, so that was my first wave. And then after that, having been abandoned and realizing that when you're in that much pain, I mean, the last thing you want to do is go through the courts. They are, torturous. And so I found myself taking very long vacations in Philippines and Asia, doing a lot of sensitive massage and energy work over there, slowly recovering. And while I was doing that, I came across Terrence Mckenna again via Sheldrake on YouTube. And in the last several months, I've listened to well over 100 hours of Terrence. And so this is really what I've noticed and appreciated. So first, a couple of things that I have gained from that overview and experience. Number one, I would say that I've come to appreciate Terrence's poetry with language. So it's definitely fun and engaging. And to use one of his words, perturbation, to perturb consciousness and reality to understand it, and words being our primary form, sound, words, imagery, psychedelics being the ways that we can perturb our mind into greater consciousness. It's kind of like if you're just suspended in water, or you start splashing it, you really start to feel how the muscles, as you're meeting resistance. And so I would say that Terrence's first gift is in this area of profound perturbation through distinction, through mental and verbal distinction. The more words and angles of a particular object that you can approach the object from, 2 degrees to the left, 2 degrees to the right, divide a line here, what is it like here, what's it like there, that every word is in a sense a lens, a way of looking at reality through that word. And Terrence adds to that complexity by inventing words, as far as I can tell, for the sheer pleasure of doing it, but words which are suggestive in their sound and meanings. And it's not always quite clear where the line between invention and borrowing and partnering of and stuff occurs with Terrence. But either way, there is a deep infusion of consciousness into language through Terrence. And so I've enjoyed that immensely. Number two, Terrence has, in the process of all that mental perturbation, helped me get a visual sense of the vastness of reality relative to the narrow bandwidth of reality through A, the five senses, and B, the very narrow spectrum within those five senses that we operate. So, if you look at the universe as a multidimensional whole, and then look at our experience of that reality, of all the reality that is, as, first of all, five pinprick holes that take us out of the shroud of darkness into glimpsing reality through sight, through sound, through taste, through touch, through smell, number one. Number two, a very narrow bandwidth of all that can be smelled, of all that can be tasted, touched, etc. So that our senses are basically a convergence of five dimensional portals of perception within a very narrow bandwidth that converges on a part of reality in which we exist in ecology. And yet, we can very, very easily extrapolate imaginatively to realize that the sounds that we are hearing might appear like colors in another lens. That if we were looking through a different measuring device and perceiving device, that rather than hearing sounds, we might see sounds. That if we tune the device one way or another, that the colors that we saw would change. That what we can see within the color spectrum of our human consciousness, really the color spectrum of our human body, is not as big as the full spectrum of color. And that this is happening on all levels. That there are sounds with sound waves that are 10 kilometers long. And as a result, not only do we not hear them, we don't see them. They're completely unconscious because we don't have measuring devices to measure those 10 kilometer sound waves. We don't have the eyes to measure vibrations that are of a higher or smaller amplitude than we are capable of seeing. And that this is inherent in the human condition. This then leads to a natural hypothesis, particularly when you cross-reference that with the fact that our conscious intention is so small relative to all the data coming in from just our five senses, that our brain, our consciousness registers only half of what we are perceiving through our five senses. So first of all, we're only perceiving things that register through these pinprick holes out into reality, number one. And number two, that we only perceive what can be measured within these particular dimensions. And then of that, we consciously only register half of that. It's a very, very, very tiny, very, very, very tiny part of reality. And then, of course, we're only focused at this location in space-time, which, it's just infinitesimal. But what it does is it suggests the probability, particularly if you do a little bit of, mind games. These are the kind of mind games that I've done to make sense of this. You take the scientific reality, which is that most of the multiverse is space, like 95% space or more. And then you've got these little particles that in and of themselves transmute between particles and waves depending on how they're measured, but you have these little particles that are spinning at a certain vibration. And if the observing and measuring devices of those particles are configured to the same vibrational density, meaning if this wheel is spinning at this speed and this wheel is spinning at this speed, and you try and cross paths, you can't, because the density is such that they bump into one another. But if you have a circle like this, an electron circling a proton, you'll have to excuse my terminology in cases where I'm just forgotten the word, but where you've got this spinning happening at a certain speed, and then you've got another particle or another wave that's going 10 times faster, it can go right through that pattern without experiencing anything. It'd be kind of like the experience of a spaceship traveling between the orbit of the Earth and the Sun, that because it's so much smaller and it's on its own vibration, there's no issue. But if you wanted a sun to intersect within the orbit of the sun and they're both spinning at the same speed, they run into each other, they collide, they repel. And so there's a sense of solidness. That solidness is basically energy and matter at a similar vibration, a similar frequency, running into each other, and they can't get through because they're moving so slowly towards one another that the revolution that defines their own identity is blocking the movement forward. And so it was Terrence's repeated kind of insight into the parallel worlds, particularly on DMT, that helped me understand that while my conscious experience is that I'm alone in this room, and my conscious experience is all calibrated to evaluate my relationship with other animals, buildings, and human beings, that the reality is that through my body, beyond what would be called physical within our current measuring devices, there are infinite dimensions that are happening simultaneously, that are above and below sensory perception, that are to the left and the right of sensory perception. And that this leads back to Einstein's basic question: is the universe a friendly place? And I've answered that question basically yes, meaning one of two things. Either that the universe is very, very big, which is undoubted, and that within that very big space, those particles, tiny little particles like human identities, that magnetize to the desire and belief that the universe is a friendly place, can easily immerse in these vast multispheres and multidimensions in which the universe is what we would humanly call friendly, or that the universe is primarily, good, beautiful, true, loving, in a sense, positive, outside of the paradigm of the human consciousness of duality, and that the only thing that is dividing everything up into all of these threats and fears is this very little box that is separating itself from everything else with the use of these 5 measuring devices. And that when we die or dissolve or move through that box, that what's there is kind of the experience of coming out of simulation, where you take off the goggles and, all the consciousness and friends that have been watching you go through your weird journey stuck inside this body are like, hooray, you're back. What did you learn? What did you explore when you had the goggles on, the goggles of eyes and noses and stuff? Because now, without that limitation, you can see, all the infinite spectrums and patterns of light and caring, etc. That's just been waiting and giving you the space, the illusion of this virtual reality. And so when we realize just how big reality is, I think it's a very hopeful thing. And I think that this is added to when I look at the amount of abuse, suffering, lies, loneliness, and scarcity that most human beings have gone through most of the hours on the planet over the last 100,000 years. And then you can find, infants born today with kindness, with presence, with radiance, with a sense of joy when they're given the set and setting. If you treat a child like a psychedelic and you emphasize the importance of intention, set, and setting, and you abandon the culture to honor that child, and you have a deep, attuned bonding with that child that's much more along the lines of, for example, a Tibetan shepherd, and who in some cases will not ever put the child down for years. There's just constant gentle attunement with nature, with rhythms, with the parents, with animals, and these children don't cry. They're not violent. Or the Thoe tribe in Brazil, where again, just the serendipity and the space there where there's no violence. Or the Tahitian tribes that were more matriarchal and just tremendously hospitable human beings. That this is actually who we would naturally be were we not traumatized back to our reptilian brain. And then abused and fed all these dangerous things like the world is a selfish place and this and that and the other, and then pushed into this capitalist system where if you care for another being, you get used and betrayed as opposed to honored and recognized. And so there's basically, from my perspective, enough evidence that suggests that human beings are basically loving, that they're basically kind, loving, generous, and that what they need is a context that honors that keeps them out of the reptilian brain of trauma and PTSD into the empathic brain or the pineal brain, which Terrence talks about in the 20 to 30,000 year ago cultures that were more community, more orgiastic, more nature-oriented, and that were facilitated in their partnership with psilocybin. So this, basically what all of this language and stuff has done for me is it's given a sense of enough friction to delve into these details and expand what is a much more visceral and detailed, really metaphor. I like that Terrence, in the talk I was listening to this evening, reminded the audience yet again that reality is not only stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine, i.e. it is far more complex than we have the measuring devices and perceiving devices to measure or perceive, which means that all truth, all theory, including science, has to be viewed as provisional. Now, I think this is wonderful. So putting that aside for a moment, I will focus on a couple of the kind of shadowy areas around the edges where I notice some inconsistency and possibility for revision in that provisional truth sense. So one of the things that I think is most striking along these lines is this dance that Terrence does between being snooty and snobbish towards channeling, intuition. There's all this stuff that he calls, rubbish. He wouldn't sit down at the same table with these folks or that folks. So there's this, whether it's a mockery of UFO people or a mockery of channeling or this or that or the other. Terrence enjoys himself immensely, heaping scorn and derision at, in one point he said that it doesn't even matter if what they're saying is true. They're not getting to the truth in the right way, so it doesn't count. And there's a definite appreciation in Terrence for science and technology, which is one of the things that makes Terrence so unique, is this deep, grounded, passionate update, and this is also, the beauty and the shadow of every ego, which no ego, including you and I, can escape, which is, I think, Terrence's desire for gratification and vindication. Vindication, I think, is one of the more human elements that I've observed in Terrence throughout bits and pieces of the narrative, starting with his experiences in La Chorrera, where it wasn't enough for him to, be surrounded by butterflies or have his pot magically cleaned. He wanted to rub it in the nose of the doubters who didn't believe, and kind of just, kind of be the hero. And it was always very annoying whenever he would go and get his witnesses for his vindication, that it seemed to ruin the spell, to ruin the magic, and what had worked for him alone didn't work in front of anyone else. And I think he's got the maturity and the humor to poke fun and just kind of delight at this little slap in the face by whatever phenomena he is being graced by, and desperation for vindication, and yet and this derision and stuff of quackery. On the other hand, if you follow between the threads, Terrence is himself amongst the most poetic, amongst the most feminine, amongst the most intuitive, amongst the most outrageous, and amongst the most channeling of individuals you're likely to meet who has himself had a UFO encounter. And so you have a certain sense, or I have a certain sense listening to Terrence, that this rational part that wants vindication and wants proof and wants to be, recognized for the profoundly important role that he's played in a context in which he's relegated to quackery by a great deal of the establishment, that is infuriated with this other part of him that is the very thing that he's promoting, this channeling, effeminate, intuitive part that he's so derisive to in everyone but himself. So there's this interesting dance there. That's really the only kind of times that I find myself questioning a lot when he's talking. It's like, Terrence, don't you get that your scorn is being directed towards yourself? you're the one channeling a mushroom, talking to fairies, doing all this stuff that can't be done, proved in a laboratory, da 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 da, and and so the sanity and the redemption in all of this comes in a humility to be observed. And so Terrence spent a lot of time developing a time model that was going to see something very dramatic happen at the same time the Mayan calendar ended in third quarter of 2012. And it's now 2017. That doesn't seem to have either happened or happened within the framework of our measuring and observing devices. And this, I think, is an important thing to be aware of. But there has not been an observable something that has changed our reality as much as the graph in his time wave theory would suggest. Now, I don't think this says something either way about the time theory, other than that, like so many things, the Mayan calendar, the coming of the New Age, like I was around the channel Lazarus for a long time, and he would talk about these years and the coming of the New Age and the new reality and the this and that and the other. And I don't think anyone programming and working with their crystals and all that leading up to those dates were saying, hooray, we've got Trump, hooray, we've got what we've got. This is what we've been waiting for. I don't think anyone would say that if you'd ask them, like, what would you imagine the New Age to be? Music, this, what would it be? It wouldn't be this. And yet this is what we have. And so it's very interesting. And I think it's actually quite wonderful because we're past all the dates. I heard so much procrastination in New Age circles leading up to 2000 and stuff but it boiled down to, why should I bother working hard and making and saving money and all that? Because it's all going to change at 2000 and all that. And so I think it's wonderful those dates are behind us. And that includes Terrence's date. And he was, his own skeptic. And so I haven't yet come across him talking about, he's dead now, and I'm not sure if he's talked about what's happened. He made one reference that he would go off into an island in shame if the date came and absolutely nothing happened. I'm not sure how he actually processed that. I'm curious. But I honor the fact, and this gets back to that ego thing and that vindication. I think having mapped out an algorithm of time that required certain events throughout human history to validate it, Terrence is one of the most amazing historians I've ever met. I have learned more about interesting aspects of history than I have ever learned in school, in all the history lessons. And I suspect that some of this was Terrence's maniacal drive to validate his time wave by showing all the dates and things that would work, and just kind of looking at the whole global history. And this has been a profound gift. And it brings me to mind of this weird experience I have of intuition that shows up almost every day. Like, I'll get an impulse that I can imagine to go out and do something I can imagine doing. And I say, okay, and I, jump on the motorbike, whatever, and go out toward it. And I'm on the way there. Along the way, the energy veers off into a direction I could not imagine, and thus could not have consciously said that's a good idea to do. So it's almost as if intuition and guidance works in a tricky way to accommodate the limitations of our imagination and our knowledge base. So it kind of works like, I wake up and I say, I just have this feeling it'd be great to go off and, see these folks at this restaurant. I think about it and I say, why not? They're nice folks. So I head off in that direction. I get a mile down the road and I get a sense that it would be really nice to go left. But I don't know why I'm going left, but I go left. That's one of the beauties of being on vacation. I go left. And then I go right. And there are these pockets of energy, and I often sometimes I even do these U-turns, and I end up in this place that I would never have been able to imagine or logically discern. And so I couldn't have made a decision to leave the house or the hotel based on going there, because I didn't even know there existed. But I start off with an intuition to go somewhere I know, which takes me into the terrain where I don't know, where I start forking off. And as long as I stay true to the energy, some pretty amazing stuff happens. So this is a power of intuition, and I kind of wonder how much things like these provisional scientific theories and provisional time waves, etc., like this. The time wave was a theory. How much it's like that, where it's not that the time wave is true, it's that the time wave takes one into an intimate knowledge of oneself that enhances one's sense of truth. That in the process of that, it leads one to prepare in a way that is more beautiful. I wasn't aware that it was Plato that popularized this beauty, truth, and goodness, this sense that, this is the kind of the nexus around which to organize reality, to aspire to. And so I really enjoy that aspect of Terrence. So back, and in that terrain, there is at times, that harsh, critical skeptic that is there, where just the tone of it is pretty left brain, which I think is great for the audience that Terrence is speaking to, which is, an incredibly sociopathic left brain Western culture that is completely truncated off from most of itself in this very narrow sliver. I think Terrence has some of the best overview of how to look at reality, how to look at oneself, and then going into the psychedelic terrain. I have not heard anyone who speaks with as much respect, with as much clarity, with as much understanding, with as much honor, and simultaneously doubt and criticism as Terrence talks about the psychedelic terrain, mostly mushrooms and DMT, though he's obviously ventured into many other terrains. The work that he's done to preserve psychedelic plants in Hawaii, profound. The work that he's done to identify things, like I haven't smoked DMT. I haven't been injected with DMT. I've had one experience with mushrooms, and that, leading into one of my biggest crises and traumas with my therapist and stuff. Absolute nightmare. And yet, as nightmarish as it is movement. And the biggest reason I was considering taking my own life to go around, to that circle, was the sense that I'm not willing to go through another 40 years of the same. I don't agree that achieving my physical goals in a state of chronic pain, fear, loneliness from these PTSD memories is an adequate justification of existence. It's not beautiful enough. It's not true enough. There's not enough goodness in that. I've never been that much of a materialist. And so even though my pain has actually spiked by 500% going through, these journey and stuff, mostly around the sloppiness and the betrayals of the therapist. I'm now in a terrain where there's a lot moving. I've learned more about psychology and the psyche in the last 2 years post recent trauma than I've learned in much of the rest of my life. The psychedelic experiences also gave me enough of a window into those worlds of other, which combined with Terrence's words, give me a sense of hope that there is a lot more to be explored, and therefore something to live for. There's potential there. I think that Terrence's suggestion that what we're doing with technology and the revelation of history, which Graham Hancock is playing a part in, is externalizing the unconscious. And I do think that is a very healthy direction. I have made literally more than 100 videos, I think closer to 200 videos in the last 6 months in a huge externalization of the semi-conscious, the unconscious, and I have found myself growing. It's part of the balance and the win-win of making this video is it's a video that I would have enjoyed watching as a fan of Terrence Mckenna, but it's also a video that helps me get to know myself, to understand where I am inside and out around one of the people that I'm spending the most time with via YouTube. I've been spending half an hour to 6 hours a day with Terrence for months now, amongst other things, and I'm really appreciating the technological role, and I'm starting to think like how we know by now the dark side of technology and media specialization and compartmentalization and all of that. But isn't it amazing that anyone in the world can pick someone such as Terrence to learn from, to kind of perturb with, do I agree with that? Do I agree with that? What about this? Why has he said that? What about this? How does that tie in with this? To have a dialogue with that would not happen without this technology. So that's kind of exciting to see where that's going, and to, with the 10 channels that I have in various topics and stuff, from shamanism to co-creating conscious relationships to PTSD and shame and abuse to reviewing people and companies, to just put that out and see how it connects. So that's that's pretty exciting, and I'm really appreciative of all the people who have put out the Terrence recordings. It's quite lovely. I love the 5 to 7 hour sessions because you really get to go into depth there. And it's fabulous to be able to do that with my eyes closed, with someone, since I have chronic fatigue and PTSD, I'm able to do this with my eyes closed in my most comfortable position. And, I've been to Esalen, but it's, even living in California, it is quite a drive. And I would not go to Esalen to see Terrence. but I will put on my YouTube. So there's a beauty in it. I appreciate that. The other areas that Terrence has explored, language, I think that's really beautiful, and I think I can get a sense of that human evolution and synesthesia that's coming. And it's fun to see this dance with technology, the way that graphics are replacing words in more and more ways. And so I think that sums up the most of it. I'll just go through the highlights again, make sure I haven't forgotten anything too blatant. Number one, infused consciousness as a result of all the language and distinctions. Number two, something I haven't fully mentioned, the willingness to call bullshit and to think in these esoteric terrains. I think that is incredibly healthy, I think it's one of Terrence's greatest strengths, is his ability and willingness and commitment to being a skeptic, and to actually, as he says, he's a very perverse person who, doesn't want to go with the flow, that likes to be, against something. And so, it's interesting to find that basically psychedelics are the only thing that he's been willing to bow to, because he couldn't be the perverse person he wanted to be and dismiss it all as bullshit and debunk it all, as he had everything else. And I think that's instructive. I think I come away with an awareness of the barbarity of the war on consciousness that is part of our governmental program. It's looking on Google around the world. There doesn't seem to be a single safe place that ethically and legally promotes the religious and scientific use of all psychedelics. Peru, recommend, will allow ayahuasca. I think there's been one instance of ayahuasca being able to be given legally within the United States as part of a religion. But it's really bizarre that you and I are at war, go head to head with our own government, and will literally be locked up in torture for years for safely and honorably exploring our own consciousness. And Terrence does a beautiful job of explaining how many scientific breakthroughs happen in working with consciousness states. The education on the dosage and nature of psychedelics and the safety. I learned about LD50 from Terrence, which helps me understand why I was at much greater risk with the MDMA experience, in which I blacked out, than mushrooms, which have an incredibly high LD50. That's the legal, that's the point at which 50% of the people die. It's called the LD50. And, that LSD and mushrooms have an enormous LD50, and as does DMT. So this, and Terrence's just clarity with the molecular structure through his brother Dennis, and just convergence, I would say. Dennis is a beautiful confluence of science, religion, mythology, drugs, ethnobotany, skepticism, practicality, and modernity, all rolled into an eclectic mix of pessimism, hope, and optimism that makes him one of the most enjoyable and insightful people that I've listened to for a long time. Hope you enjoy this. And if Terrence McKenna is new to you, do check out. Just type in the word, listen for a couple of hours, and I highly recommend the book on Audible, Food for the Gods.